Now, the other thing about Rendlesham that I always find strange is it's very close to Orford Ness Island, where we know nuclear tests took place. I've actually visited some of the bunkers out there where they carried out nuclear explosions. Of course, they held nuclear missiles at Bywaters, RAF Bywaters. Is there, do you think, some connection between our own tests and what was going on? Or perhaps even if aliens were visiting, perhaps they were visiting because of those nuclear explosions? What's your view on that?
Well, now, without wanting to start a whole load of conspiracy theories, or rather perpetuate the ones that are already circulating, it's been the long-standing policy of Her Majesty's government neither to confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons at any particular location.
But we know they were there, Nick.
At any particular location, at any particular time. So I'm not going to comment on the nuclear issues.
Now, if we've got things that are flying in our airspace and are making that sort of impact, why do the Ministry of Defence continue to say they pose no threat to our airspace?
Well, I think the whole issue of threat is very difficult. In military terms, in governmental terms, a threat is actually defined as capability plus intent. So, in other words, to give a somewhat facetious example, France has nuclear weapons, so there is a capability. However, realistically speaking, they're not going to launch their nuclear weapons at us. So, because there's a capability but no intent, there is no threat. So, one has to argue in relation to the UFO issue. Are we talking capability? Well, yes, if we've got structured craft in our airspace and they're not ours, it doesn't matter if they're Russian or Martian, but
well, on that very point, let's go back to 1957 and Milton Torres, because the government actually gave shoot-down orders, I believe, to Milton Torres when he was pursuing an alleged UFO. Now, in the current run of disclosure, it seems to have been breezed over that it was probably more likely a Russian craft that he was pursuing, but surely that would have been just as dangerous to issue shoot-down orders against a Russian craft over Manston in Kent.
Well, any decision to use lethal force is obviously always the last option. And it's a very difficult case. I've met Milton Torres. I spent several days with him when we were speaking at a conference a couple of years ago in Washington, D.C. He's a deeply honourable and truthful man. The difficulty, of course, is that we don't have any contemporary documents. People are still looking. But it's very difficult to get to the bottom of this. But yes, clearly, any shoot-down order is something that could have catastrophic consequences. It's happened a couple of other times. Parvez Jafari in 1976 in Iran attempted to launch an air-to-air missile at a UFO that had entered restricted airspace. Oscar Santa Maria Huertas in Peru in 1980 opened fire on a UFO with his machine cannon from his aircraft. Again, a UFO had entered restricted airspace. Going back to your question, the MOD's line that UFOs are of no defence significance is I think difficult to maintain in terms of those sorts of incidents. And it seems to me that there are two different things. It's quite possible to say maybe there's no threat. If that's MOD's assessment, that's fine. I think what's more difficult to say, and it's a different thing, because we're back to this threat equals capability plus intent. What is more difficult to sustain is the idea that UFOs are somehow of no defence significance, because I think defence significance can mean all sorts of things, and just in terms of if there's advanced technology that we don't possess, well, it doesn't matter if it's extraterrestrial or if it's Russian. We want it, and that must self-evidently be of defence interest. So I think MOD's line was unsustainable on that, and maybe the difficulty of all of this was one reason why MOD, in frustration, just disengaged from the whole subject, publicly at least.
I think it's probably a good idea they didn't actually shoot down the UFO, because, as you once said on my radio show, I think last thing we need right now is an intergalactic war.
Yes, I think, I go back to the point, any decision to use lethal force must be in line with rules of engagement and really should be defensive only.
Warminster, obviously, major legends here with regards to Warminster sightings of the 60s. Now, Professor John Searle claims they were all down to him and flying discs, his anti-gravity vehicle. Want to ask you first off about that, and then what you're going to be talking about this weekend in Warminster.
Well, John Searle's claims are interesting. In the intelligence analysis community, there's an old phrase that people use: interesting if true. And it's not a story that I've researched in any great detail, so I'm going to have to fall back on interesting if true. With regard to my own talk, I'm going to be doing three things. Firstly, very briefly, giving an overview of the latest release of MOD UFO files and focusing in particular on the story that caught the media's attention, the Winston Churchill story, that he was somehow involved in a UFO cover-up. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the Royal Society's 2-day discussion meeting held in London, January 2010, subject: the detection of extraterrestrial life and the consequences for science and society.
Which has been taken out of proportion online, hasn't it?
There's been misunderstandings, I think, about what that conference was and what it wasn't, and I'm going to be hopefully giving an overview of what happened and trying to set the record straight. And finally, of course, what I've actually been advertised as speaking about: Bentwaters and the 30th anniversary.
Now, just coming back to the Churchill thing very briefly, I was going to be having a chat with Arabella Churchill, who was Churchill's granddaughter, who was working in Glastonbury on a number of charity projects and was one of the original organisers of the Glastonbury Festival. And we were going to discuss this actual thing of whether or not there are still papers within the family about his interest in UFOs. And unfortunately, she died abroad before she came home, so we never got to do that interview. But what's your thoughts on it? Do you believe Churchill had a very strong interest in UFOs?
We know Churchill had an interest in it, and of course his 1952 memo to the Air Ministry and to Lord Cherwell made it very clear. He said, what does all this stuff about flying saucers mean? What does it amount to? What is the truth? Please let me have a report. What is less clear is whether this latest story about Churchill conspiring with Eisenhower to keep secret details of an encounter that an RAF crew had in the Second World War is true. It's alleged that this was done because he was fearful of mass panic and he thought that it would shatter people's religious faith. Unfortunately, this is a third-hand story at best. It's somebody who wrote to the MOD and said, my grandfather was one of Churchill's bodyguards and this is the story that was told. But there's no contemporary documentation to back that up, and I just want to make that point clear in my presentation.
Well, I'm looking forward to the presentation, Nick. It's always a joy to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.